Hi everyone, I'm Mark Harrigan and I'm going to be talking today about how we can use social media for public engagement. The opportunities that it offers to reach audiences and build connections and relationships outside of academia, but also the dilemmas that we confront in doing so, because the debate about social media often tends to be polarized between people who are extremely enthusiastic on the one hand and those who just fundamentally don't like the idea that it's something academics should or could do on the other. And hopefully today I'll present a realistic account that recognizes there are important things we can do with social media in the sphere of public engagement, while also being realistic about the fact there are many limits to it and there are some reasons why we ought to be cautious. But before we do that, it's useful just to spend a moment thinking about what we're talking about when we use the phrase social media. Because there's a sense in which all media are social. It's very hard to think of a media which isn't social. But when we talk about social media, we tend to be referring to mass commercial social media platforms, ones which began to emerge in the early 2000s, which were built around the making and sharing of content within networks. These developments led to a huge wave of enthusiasm in the immediate years following their launch, and the political scientist Gary King captures this in a phrase where he describes the largest increase in the expressive capacity of humanity in the history of the world. I think it's an overstatement, but I like it because it's a powerful, poetic overstatement, which compares social media effectively to something like the printing press, which I don't think is an inherently ridiculous comparison to make, albeit one we should treat with caution. And while when I started doing talks on social media, well over a decade now, there was often a lack of familiarity with what we were talking about. Now, many of these platforms will be familiar to all of you: Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. There are others that will be familiar to many of you still, I'm sure, things like Pinterest, Snap, or Reddit, and others which might be less well known, such as TikTok, BeReal, and Mastodon. And it can be difficult to follow social media because there's a sense in which the landscape is always changing. New platforms are springing up, old ones are fading away. And there's all sorts of startups that have some promise but don't really catch fire. And they're likely to, in time, fall away, but there's uses we can make of them in the meantime. And to make this landscape a bit more tractable, I've always loved this comic by John Atkinson, which compares social media to more familiar kinds of technologies and artifacts we use. Instagram is a way of sharing photos, Pinterest is like a pinboard. Facebook is like an address book, Skype is like a telephone. The point can be overstated, but I think it is a useful point to make because it's easy to focus on the novelty of social media platforms, even ones that have now been with us for well over a decade. Whereas I think it's more useful to think about the uses we make of them, because the things we try and do through social media platforms are things which human beings have long tried to do. And so these are technologies which offer new ways of fulfilling existing needs. And when we frame it in those terms, it's easier to compare the use we're making of them now to the uses we've made of other technologies in the past. But there are other things that often aren't thought about as social media. So things like writing for multi-author blogs and online magazines. Developing personal websites which include information about your work and enable people to keep up to date with your activities. Participating in informal networks, either through platforms like Teams or Zoom, or Discord, Slack, even things like using Google Docs. And finally, using software like Evernote or OneNote to organize, review, and sometimes share the material you find online. And while these, we could argue about whether these should be classed as social media, I think it's useful to cast the net widely and think about this broader landscape of services in which academics are now operating. Social media has become widespread within universities. The most robust data we have suggests 13 to 30% of academics at Russell Group universities, but this is something that I think has likely grown since the pandemic. And there's increasing evidence it's regarded as essential, a way through which we indicate that we're publicly engaged to our employers. It's also used by journals, research groups, departments, and universities, and in short, it's become a relatively mainstream part of academic life in a brief period of time. And the enforced reliance on digital media that we all experienced during the pandemic has only accelerated that process. Even so, I think the reasons why academics have chosen to use social media are pretty consistent through this time. It's opportunities for networking, encouraging the readership of your publications, connecting with external audiences, getting feedback, a range of outlets through which you can publish more creative kinds of writing, the opportunities to talk about ideas, exploring beyond the boundaries of your field, keeping up to date with developments, and tracking external sectors, external developments in real time. But I'd suggest that foremost amongst these reasons are two, which are less to do with creative fulfillment and more to do with the career pressures of being an academic in the contemporary university. The first is the pressure to ensure that our work is read and cited, and academics are obviously far from alone in contemporary society in being subject to the pressure of metrics. But it is an important one, and social media holds out the promise that we might increase the visibility and engagement with our publications. The second is research impact and the pressure to demonstrate that our work has a wider societal relevance, that we are engaged with external audiences, and ideally that our funded work makes a difference and brings about some change in the wider world. And I think recognizing this pressure is really key to having a nuanced perspective on how we might use social media for public engagement. Because there's been a lot of excitement about free, immediate, effective ways of engaging with external audiences, little to no expertise needed. And this excitement can be seen in how directly and indirectly it's encouraged within higher education. Particularly funding councils, organisations like the National Coordinating Centre for Public Engagement, research impact offices within universities. There's been a push for what is now a substantial period of time to encourage staff to use social media, which I think can be seen as, in part, an attempt to build a culture of engagement within universities. It's hard to say exactly what's involved to build this culture, so let's get everyone using social media, because that seems like a good start. You can see this across the kind of standard toolbox which funded projects adopt. Most now have a website and a presence across one or more social media platforms. And it's routinely seen as an expected part of external engagement. And what I want to suggest is that the extent of this assumption can actually be quite problematic. There are very useful and effective ways we can use social media, but it's not a catch-all solution to the problem of public engagement. And if we operate as if it is, then we're going to encounter problems relatively quickly. A useful way to think about these limits is by looking at the platforms which most UK internet users are operating on. So 74.8% of the UK internet using population uses WhatsApp, 73.5% Facebook, 58.5% Facebook Messenger, 35.4% iMessage, 30.2% Pinterest. So a lot of the platforms which are most widely used are either very difficult to do public engagement with or pretty much impossible to do public engagement with. So the fact that social media is widespread amongst the UK population doesn't mean those people are automatically amenable to academics trying to engage with them online. The choice of the platforms we have is actually relatively narrow compared to the full selection. And given the finite time and energy available to us, we can't engage in every platform. So we have to make choices. And what I'm talking about today will hopefully give you some useful ideas to think about how those choices can be made. And once we're talking in this register, we immediately confront a number of dilemmas about digital public engagement. We often overestimate the intrinsic interest of our research, and it's easy to do this because when we spend years focusing on a topic, it's very easy to lose sight of the fact that it's more interesting to us than it is to other people. Even if our work obviously relates to social media audiences, it doesn't necessarily mean they will be interested. We have to work to generate that interest, and that communications work is something that academic training rarely equips us to do. It might be that you have a particularly exciting topic. For a long time, I studied asexuality, which, particularly at the time I was doing it, attracted a huge amount of media attention. It was very easy to get people interested in that topic, whereas my actual PhD research on the social ontology of personhood was much less interesting. And while you may have a topic which pulls people to it, I'm operating under the assumption that is a relatively rare thing. And so we need to think about how people are busy and how people on social media, particularly, are distracted. The challenge, therefore, becomes how we cut through this distraction. Because it's important to remember that as vast as the audience may be, your posts will only be seen, let alone engaged with, by a tiny fraction of your followers. To build a substantial following on social media takes a long time, and it almost certainly takes daily or near daily engagement. This is something that's very hard to do in the 2 to 3 year window of activity, in which most funded projects will be at least at a stage where they can do this kind of engagement. And furthermore, you have to remember that social media firms want to minimize the unpaid distribution of content. They offer this notion of organic reach, that we can use social media to talk to the world in order to encourage people to freely offer content online. But these are advertising-based business models, and over time, the reach of posts online has tended to decline because social media firms have felt under pressure to increase the amount of advertising income that they take in. So there's something a little bit misleading about the promise that social media firms hold out to us. And it's in this context that we need to be realistic about the time we have available to this, because social media firms are designed to tempt you to spend ever more time on them. If you found yourself wasting time on social media, if you found yourself checking Twitter or Instagram when you're supposed to be doing something else, you're not alone in this. This is very sophisticated, real-time applied behavioral science that is orientated towards what they call increasing user engagement. They want people to come back more frequently, to engage with more material when they're there, and to generate more data that can be used to sell advertising products. There are techniques that you could use to mitigate this. So being strategic about how you plan content, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, can be useful. Scheduling your posts through a service like Buffer or Hootsuite can ensure that you do social media work in allotted periods of time, rather than have it creep into your daily working life and become a perpetual distraction. You can also audit your screen time using systems like Screen Time built into iOS, or products like Moment, which track how many times you pick up your phone. These are ways of mitigating the problem, but there is still fundamentally a problem. It can be very easy to waste a lot of time. If you're very self-controlled, you have a busy life, and you really don't care in the slightest about this activity, then you have a good chance of being able to avoid this. But particularly if you find some pleasure in it, if it is sometimes an interesting or useful distraction, if you're also using social media to keep in touch with colleagues, collaborators, acquaintances, friends, at the same time as running a more official account, it can be very easy to get sucked in, even if you're aware of the risks. And I think we could say overall that the ratio of how much time you need to put in for the returns you get has been shrinking. It shrinks if you start using social media in a distracted or time-sinking way, but it also shrinks because it's harder to be heard on these platforms as they become more cacophonous, and it's harder to have cut-through as they've tried to increase reliance upon paid advertising. And perhaps most importantly, these are also platforms where harassment and abuse are rife. The turmoil currently underway at Twitter means that these issues are likely to get worse rather than better. And insofar as universities are encouraging staff to be active and visible on social media, without recognizing the fact that white men such as myself will rarely get abused online, whereas colleagues of colour and female colleagues are much more likely to get hostility online. There's a big EDI issue here, which I think universities have needed to address for some time. This is a very brief overview of a very complex issue, but we could talk more about it. And because of these dilemmas, if you want to engage through social media, if you want to try and do digital public engagement, you need to strategize for this. It's important not just to dive straight in and imagine that accumulating Twitter followers or having your videos viewed on YouTube is a sign of successful engagement. I'd suggest you need to think first of all with great clarity about who your audience or audiences are. Be as specific as possible. Think about what you know about them. Think about what you know about their interests. Think about your existing relationships. And this can help you strategize about how to connect with them, to understand what platforms they're on, to understand what ways of relating will be useful or interesting or evocative to them. This means you have to understand why they will be interested. You have to make a case. You have to have a sense of exactly what kind of relationship you're trying to form. And I stress here how important it is to think of this in terms of relationships, even if they're relatively thin relationships. While there is a place, I think, that broadcasting and dissemination on social media can have, I think for public engagement through social media, it's unlikely to be effective, particularly if you're operating on the life cycle of a 3 or 4 year funded project. And so you need to think about what kind of connections you want to build with who and why they will be interested. And finally, eventually the resources available to you for this. Your own time, energy and expertise if you're working in a team. Who in the team is able to contribute? What support can your institution provide? How can your institution support getting the message out across existing networks they have access to? Are there gatekeepers, Are there people who already have visibility within relevant communities who might be able to support you in your engagement? So there's a lot here, and this 4-part structure is the foundation of a much longer workshop that I sometimes do about this. If anyone is interested, I can send along a worksheet which offers more detailed questions to think about for each of these points. But the key thing I want to stress is that you do need to think about them rather than just dive straight in. And so what I'm suggesting is not that social media is useless or that social media is terrible. I've spent the last 12 years encouraging academics to use social media, supporting them in this, and being extremely active myself across a whole range of platforms and projects. I'm not hostile to social media by any means. I remain very enthusiastic about it in a lot of respects. But I think it's important that we have realistic expectations. We need to approach social media as one tool in the public engagement toolbox, one that's likely to be most effective when integrated into other forms of engagement, such as building connections after events. And if we do this, it becomes easier to ensure that we don't waste time on social media that could be better spent on other forms of engagement activity. It's a sad reality that social media is content hungry, and to avoid this becoming incredibly onerous, you need to think about your existing research activities and things you generate through those, such as slides, recordings, extracts, which can be produced and shared online to reduce the workload involved. To give an example, this video that I've produced is me practicing for a workshop I'm doing in person in a couple of days. Given I'm doing this rehearsal anyway, I thought I might as well record it, put it on YouTube, share it on my blog. It can be a bit artificial when you begin thinking in these terms, but actually as academics, we're producing materials all the time, particularly for teaching, and sharing them, often adapting them very slightly in order to be shared, can be a very useful way of being active on social media without having to do much additional work. Thirdly, I'd suggest that we just need to get away from the idea of our material going viral or achieving celebrity. There's a much longer argument I could make here, which I don't think I've got time to in this context, but the point I'd make, informed by empirical research and theoretical analysis, is that your quality of interactions with relevant audiences is much more important than your quantity of interactions with general audiences. The metrics social media platforms operate with and present to you are designed to encourage you to think in the most general terms. How many followers do you have? How many people shared my post? Rather than thinking in that maximizing quantitative outlook, I think it's much more useful to think qualitatively, even if it's hard to operationalize that or find reliable indicators that can help us assess it. And finally, it's necessary to invest time and energy to do public engagement well. There has in the past been a tendency for funded projects to just simply tack this on to an administrator's role as an additional bit of communications, or assume that a postdoc on the project is a young person so they can do it alongside their other work. I think it's important to provide training and support. It's important to recognize the work involved in doing this. And I think if you don't have the resources for this personally or institutionally, it might be worth considering restricting yourself to making your project visible online. That doesn't mean not being active, but it means seeing that activity as being about ensuring people can find you online, ensuring your existing connections are sustained through these channels, but not trying to engage, not trying to get out there in an active way, not trying to grow your footprint. And I might have made this sound like an overly stark dichotomy, but I'm increasingly convinced that it's important to recognize that digital public engagement is a specialized undertaking. It's one which can be difficult to do well, and it takes time, energy, and expertise. And I think it's important to plan from that as a starting point, rather than, as I've said, simply diving in and seeing what happens. I hope this has been useful, and I hope it didn't seem overly negative. I think there are brilliant things we can do with social media for public engagement. I think it's a crucial tool in the toolbox we have for this sort of engagement. And it's also part of the landscape that is here to stay. I think we're 15 years into a 30-year media revolution, and we need to adapt to this, and we need to mainstream it, we need to institutionalize it. And the way to do that is not to say that we have to dive into it because it's the new thing that's important, but rather to see it in a pragmatic lens and assess it in the way we would other things we're doing, to think about the opportunities, to think about the costs, and to think about what we're bringing to it, what we want to achieve, and whether it's right for us. And I hope this short talk gives you some ideas about how you might do that. And I look forward to talking in a different setting. Thank you very much.